my name is Blake. Welcome. I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I DNF'd in 2023. I have 10 books to talk about. Most of them are fantasy. I had a really terrible reading year in 2023 and I became the DNF queen. I have DNF'd a couple times in the past, but never this much before. And at some point last year, I was like, why am I reading books I don't like? And I have always pushed myself to finish books because I'm a completionist. I love checking something off the list, so to speak. And I have always had the mindset that what if the ending is really good? But I've never read a book where the end redeemed a bad book for me, so I have just decided to embrace the DNF. I'm not going to go into much detail about what these are about, and I'm just going to go in the order that I read them. First up, I have Crossroads of Canopy by Thorea Dyer. And in this book, we are following this young girl who is living in this kingdom in the treetop canopies, and there are other kingdoms that exist there, and she's sold into slavery by her parents. This is a coming of age story, and I had quite a few issues with this one. It's a little over 300 pages long, and I ended up DNFing this at about the 100-page mark. I was buddy reading this with a friend, and neither of us were enjoying it. It had a lot of issues with the plot and the pacing, and there were just random things that kept interrupting the story. We would pause to talk about something else, or there would be world building. It just felt very jarring. It didn't feel very cohesive. My friend and I were like, what's going on? We were 100 pages in and we weren't really seeing what the plot of the book was. And the main character herself feels very juvenile. It is supposed to be a coming of age story. Hello, you're gone. Yes, hello. Next, I have Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. And unfortunately, Neil Gaiman is very much a hit or miss author for me, and this one was not a hit. And we are in this world where we are following our main character who comes across this woman who is from the other London, where people just slip between the cracks and are forgotten. And I loved the idea of the story and a lot of the elements in it, but I found the character to be so insufferable. He was just a terrible character to follow. He never stands up for himself. He just lets things happen to him. And whenever things get hard, he just gives up. It drove me insane. And I was like, is this a character that I want to even be rooting for? So I was just not interested in the character. I don't think that he got very much development. I don't think that any of the characters really got very much development. And I actually made it through 70-75% of this, so a good way through when I was like, I can't read this character anymore. And I DNF'd the book, and I was curious to see if he had any development by the end. So I looked up a Google summary, and I'm really glad that I quit when I did, because I was so angry reading the end of this book. I can't imagine how frustrated I would have been if I actually had to sit there and read it. Next, I have A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. This is the prequel to Priory of the Orange Tree, which I have not read. And I did hear mixed things about Priory of the Orange Tree, but I heard a lot of people say that they really loved this one even more than Priory, and they say that it was better written, and there were some people recommended reading this one first. And I absolutely love the covers for this series, so I wanted to love it. Sadly, I didn't. This book was like 800, 900 pages long. I made it to page 440 before throwing in the towel. I was like, I don't know why I'm reading this book. It's like pulling teeth to read it. Nothing was happening. And I kept pushing myself to keep going because I was like, surely anything has to happen by this point. Because why am I reading this then? And there are so many characters that are being introduced to us, and I feel like they really aren't relevant to the story or what's going on. Like, I was able to keep the characters pretty separate from one another because they do live in unique settings. so that was beneficial. But the characters themselves, I just didn't care about. I didn't feel connected to anyone because there were so many characters and we had so many POV characters, and even the POV characters I couldn't care about. And I just felt like the story was kind of aimlessly going nowhere, so I just called it quits. Up next, I have My Plain Jane, and this is by an author trio, and they write about famous women named Jane, but as retellings. And this one is a Jane Eyre retelling, which retellings are kind of hard for me anyway. I feel like they have to be reminiscent of the original work. Like, I want the same vibes, but also at the same time, I want them to have their own unique spin. And in this one, we're following Jane Eyre, and the only thing that's unique about this one really is that there is a ghost problem and there is a paranormal agency that is collecting these ghosts. But the story follows very closely to the Jane Eyre story, and the ghosts really aren't as prominent as I had hoped they would be. I wanted to read a spooky ghost story, and I had heard that these books were really funny, but I didn't find it funny. I didn't think the ghosts were great. I didn't think the characters were great. Charlotte Bronte is a character in this book, and I absolutely hated her. I wasn't that interested in anyone. I had a really tough time with YA in 2023. I don't necessarily think that I've grown out of YA. I do still think that YA should be enjoyable to me, but yet in 2023 I hadn't been able to find any good ones. So I'm hoping for better YA luck in 2024. But this one was just too similar to the original story for me. And on that note, I have another YA book here titled A Wicked Magic. And in this book, we're following Dan and Liz, who are witches, and they accidentally curse their boyfriend and give his soul to a demon. I feel like I was kind of on the fence about this one to begin with. Just reading the summary, I knew that it was going to be pretty drama heavy, but I really loved the cover, and I really love a witchy book, so I wanted to give it a try. I think I made it about 20% of the way through it before figuring out that it just wasn't for me. The relationship between Dan and Liz was incredibly toxic. The relationships throughout the entire book in general are just really toxic, whether they are friendships or relationship dynamics. And I also found this one was just kind of very repetitive in the way that it was written. I felt like we were going over kind of the same conversation points and topics over and over again. And miscommunication or lack of communication are huge in regards to the plot and relationships in the story. And those are two tropes that I absolutely hate. So in the end, I figured out earlier rather than later that this one was not going to be one that I was going to continue on with, which I'm really sad about because I loved the cover. It's got a cat on it. Next, I have How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. We meet this woman and her parents have mysteriously died, and she has to go and deal with their affairs. And it deals a lot with family and relationship dynamics. But she discovers that this house is haunted, but it takes a really long time to get to that point. I think I was like 33% in, and it wasn't spooky at all. I mean, there were a couple unusual things that had happened, but overall it wasn't that scary yet at that point. I saw a lot of people say that the book never really gets spooky, so I just decided to put this one down because I was pretty bummed because that's what I went into this book for. I also thought that this was going to be a ghost story, which is what I was wanting, but it turns out that this was actually puppets. Like, that was the horror element in this, and I myself am not a fan of puppets or dolls. I went into this one with very different expectations, and it was just not what I was expecting. And I also feel like our main character was just really unlikable. She's a very unreliable narrator, I think. There's one scene in the beginning when she says that her family was poor growing up and they couldn't afford much. But then she later talks about how she had all of these really expensive extracurricular activities that she did after school. And she also lies to her daughter a lot. So, I don't know. I wasn't liking the character or the haunted house element. And I felt like it was taking a really long time to get to that point. Like I was waiting for, the spooky elements to appear, and they never showed up by the time I DNF'd it. And up next I have Mythago Wood. This is an old one that received a couple of awards, I believe, and it is about an enchanted forest. This man was obsessed with the forest, and it was his life's work. And it is the forest of old legends. Robin Hood, King Arthur, they exist here in this forest. But when he dies, he leaves this forest to his sons, and they are kind of forced to figure out what to do with the woods before they get sucked into it themselves. This book definitely showed its age. I think I have never read a fantasy book with fantastical elements that felt so unmagical. And I don't know if that makes sense to anyone, but reading this book felt like I was reading a newspaper. Just the way the magic was described in the forest setting, it felt so dull. But how can that be possible? You're talking about an enchanted forest. I was so interested going into it. And then it's talked about like I'm reading a math textbook. It was just so boring. That's one word I could use to describe this: boring. And I really don't like the way that female characters were talked about. So Guinevere, which I don't think she was called that in the book, but basically she's Guinevere from the King Arthur legends. And I think she was called Gwyneth in the book, something like that. And both of the sons are in love with her. But she is talked about in a way that's really detached. They're absolutely obsessed with her, which I thought was really... Some of the things they say about her are really creepy and disturbing. They're constantly calling her the girl. They never even talk about her as a person. They don't mention her name. These guys are just fighting over the girl. And I thought it was kind of gross, some of the ways that she was described and the things they would say about her. I just wasn't interested. And it's about 300 pages, and I made it to about 115 pages in. Next, I have Bunny by Mona Awad, and this is a dark academia where we are following this girl who is kind of an outcast in her group. But she kind of gets sucked into this group of girls called the Bunnies, and they're kind of like Mean Girls. I've seen a lot of comparisons that this is like Mean Girls meets Heather, and I think that's a pretty accurate comparison. I was listening to this on audiobook, and the bunnies are described as being like carbon copies of one another, and they all speak with really high-pitched, girly voices. Like, "Hi, Bunny, I love you, Bunny, you look amazing, Bunny." And it drove me insane, so I had to stop listening to the audiobook. Not trashing the narrator or anything, she did a great job. It's just that's the way they were described to have spoken, and that is the way she spoke. But I was actually hearing, their voices, that annoying sound, while I couldn't stop hearing it in my brain, so I had to switch to the ebook. But then, as I was reading, I noticed another issue that was bugging me from the very beginning. Our main character is like a human chameleon. She has no personality or interest of her own. She, like the guy from Neverwhere, she doesn't stand up for herself. She doesn't do anything for herself. She's a doormat. She doesn't seem to have any of her own wants or thoughts. She just adopts the personality of whoever she's with, which really drove me insane. She was also really indecisive. She couldn't decide anything. She had to ask other people to make decisions for her. She couldn't decide one way or the other on anything pertaining to anything in her life. And she just kind of lets things happen to her. And I, again, made it to about the 35% mark, where she is getting sucked into the bunnies group, and she begins to adopt their personalities as well. I was like, I can't do it anymore. I hate reading about these kinds of characters. Here I have the last two, and they were actually soft DNFs. I plan to return to these in the future. But the first one I have is Murder Your Employer. And in this one, we are following a man who is accepted to this university where they teach you to kill your employer. And it was a really cool premise, but I don't think I was expecting it to be written the way it was. It seems like it's very a humorous story, and it's written through journal entries, and I was expecting it to be more of a thriller or a horror going into it. So I was pleasantly surprised when I picked it up that it wasn't what I was expecting, and I was enjoying it, but I just got caught up in some other fantasy books at the time, and I was just really in a fantasy mood. So I decided to put it down and come back to it later when I knew I would be more in the mood for it. I have the book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. I have never read a Mark Lawrence book before, and this was definitely not what I was expecting. I didn't know what I was expecting going in because I've heard so many different things about it, and it was definitely not what I would have thought it was based on what I had heard about it. And honestly, I'm not really even sure what was going on at the time that I got to it, but I was 40% of the way into it. But I have heard that the ending is really amazing, so I do want to keep continuing on to see what all the stir is about, because I do think it's well written. I think it's interesting, but the ending is what I'm really interested in, because I have seen quite a few people saying that the ending blew them away. So I do want to know what went on at the end of there. And for this one, my hold expired from the library after I had paused it for a bit. I am on the holds list once again. I will have to wait several months to get my hands on it again, but once I do, I will pick this one up and continue it. Those were all the books that I DNF'd in 2023. Let me know if you have read any of these. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again with another video soon.